Good evening, everyone. We are delighted to welcome you at the CSH for this evening's presentation by Roland Lardinois entitled Is the Concept of Caste a Relevant Comparative Concept? Roland Lardinois, as many of you would know, is a sociologist and an emeritus research director at the CNRS, the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique. His research first focused on the history of Indian studies in France. In 2013, he published a book on this theme entitled Scholars and Prophets, Sociology of India from France, 19th and 20th Century, which was published by Routledge. And on the similar theme, he is currently conducting some research work on Sylvain Lévy. Roland Lardinois later started another major research work on the history and the sociology of Indian engineers in collaboration with several Indian and French researchers. He conducted part of this research work when he was deputed at the CSH from 2009 to 2013. And this research work resulted in the publication recently of a book in French entitled Les mondes de l'ingénieur en Inde, so the worlds of the engineer in India, 19th and 20th century, which he co-edited with Charles Gadea. And there will be another edited volume for those of you who read in English mostly. So another edited volume in English published by OUP, which will be edited by Vanessa Caru. And the title will be Engineers and Society. And Roland has participated in this edited volume. More recently, and closer to the topic of this evening's presentation, Roland has also published several articles on the issue of caste, including Caste in Higher Education in India in the Journal of Interdisciplinary History, and The History of Caste Through Ages, Concepts, Words, Things, which will be published in the forthcoming edited volume, The Oxford Handbook of Caste, co-edited by Surinder Jotka and Jules Naudet. To discuss his presentation this evening, Professor Satish Deshpande has come to and is with us this evening. So Satish is currently the M.N.S. Srinivas Chair Professor at the Institute for Social and Economic Change in Bengaluru. Before this, he was, of course, Professor of Sociology at Delhi University. His research interests include caste and class inequalities, contemporary social theory, politics, and history of the social sciences, as well as South-South interactions. He has written many books, but among the books which are directly relevant for this evening's topic, I would like to mention Untouchability in Rural India, which he co-authored with Ghanshyam Shah, Harsh Mander, Sukhdev Thorat, and Amitabh Haviskar, as well as the edited volume, The Problem of Caste, which was published in 2014. Most recently, he also published a volume on a different topic, Sectarian Violence in India, Hindu-Muslim Conflict, which he co-edited with Sanjay Palshikar. So again, welcome to all of you this evening. Let me remind you the title of tonight's presentation, Is the Concept of Caste a Relevant Comparative Concept? Thank you very much.
Bonjour, welcome. Many thanks to the CSH for having me here, particularly to Odile Henry for her kind invitation. Thanks to Satish for discussing my paper. And thanks to you all for being here this evening, whether in the room or at distance. My presentation should last about 1 hour. When I was asked for the title of my communication, I gave it the form of a question: is the concept of caste a relevant comparative concept? My thinking has evolved since I formulated this question. So what I'm presenting today is a work in progress. The comparison I will discuss concerns the category of caste, class, and race, a subject that makes up the bulk of the comparative literature on caste. Having read part of this vast literature, I concluded that there are so many differences between the authors dealing with caste, but it seems impossible to decide between their judgments that differ widely according to their viewpoints. One reason why the authors differ when they address the comparative nature of caste is suggested by an American philosopher, Gallagher, who was then professor of ethics, who wrote in 1946, caste I quote, caste is both a sociological description and a moral judgment, unquote. 70 years later, echoing Gallagher, the editorial of the first issue of the journal Caste, published in 2020, states, I quote, Caste is a journal about ethics and moral philosophy, end quote. Next slide, please. So the main question I would like to address in the following is, if caste is both a sociological description and a moral judgment, how can we understand the variety of evaluative judgments made by scholars when they compare caste, class, and race? To answer this question, I'm going to consider this issue in its historical dimension and drawing on recent work on the sociology of values. This work has grown up from the article I wrote for the Oxford Handbook of Caste, forthcoming hopefully next month, maybe next week. But the focus here is different as I deal with the comparative aspect of caste in the longue durée. Next slide, please. My presentation has 5 parts. I will begin with a few preliminary remarks before briefly presenting the Buddhist critique of caste, and then the first comparative moment, which is the encounter with the Portuguese. I will then present the comparative matrix that will shed light on the debate that developed from the 19th century onward around the trilogy of caste, class, and race. It is this debate that I will discuss in part 4 and 5. And to conclude, I will come back to the model I'm proposing and with some epistemological consideration. Next slide. So I start with 5 preliminary remarks. First, the concept of caste is lexical, which means that it depends on the language we use. Secondly, the concept of caste is disjunctive, whether we deal with caste or with the caste system. Third, the concept of caste is indexical, which means that it depends on the context of enunciation of a particular author. Fourth remark, comparing caste engages a relationship of otherness, of altérité. Whether it is an internal otherness, this is the Buddhist critique of caste, or an external otherness, this is the Portuguese and the Afro-American encounters. And finally, fifth remark, I will not give a priori definition of caste to avoid anachronisms. I come to my first point, the Buddhist critique of caste. Next one, please. There are at least 3 main reasons why we should consider the Buddhist critique of caste. Firstly, it is to depart from the idea that the discourse on caste is written on a blank page, beginning with the colonial era, whether British or Portuguese. Secondly, the Buddhist critique is the first and quite radical critique of caste, more than a critique of the caste system, and it is a critique that denaturalizes caste. And thirdly, concerning caste, ancient India leaves its mark on contemporary India. My main references here are Vincent Etchlinger and Wilhelm Alpha's book, but you will find the reference in the handout. Next one, please. I will limit myself to some general consideration regarding the Buddhist critique of caste. First, what is the lexis of caste in Buddhist Sanskrit text? When the Buddhists speak of class of the Brahmin, the term used is varna. When the Buddhists specify born into a Brahmin caste, the term used is jati, like in the term Brahman jati. Varna is a sociological concept concerning the structure of the Brahminical society, while Jati is an anthropological concept embracing both animal, vegetal, and human beings. Second point, the Buddhist critique deals with the false or erroneous views of the Brahmin, what Vincent Etchlinger called allodoxia, erroneous view concerning the birth of the Brahmin, their affiliation, and their ethics, or in terms of soteriology. There is a double critique. Firstly, Buddhists denaturalize caste as jati in the sense that they consider jati as the reification of a pure entity of designation, to use their nominalist viewpoint. And here I'm quoting almost verbatim Vincent Etchlinger. The Buddhists defend also the idea that all human beings belong to one dharna, what they call ekavarna. Secondly, Buddhists ethicize caste in redefining what is a true Brahmin, which means for the Buddhist, a Buddhist, which involved a theory of the degradation of the Brahmin at that time, developed by the Buddhists. But a true Brahmin or Buddhist is not by accident of birth, but by the quality of its own deeds, that is, by its own merits. For the Buddhist, we can say that we are not born Brahmin, we become one, or we are not born Brahmin that in the sense of true Buddhist. We become one through action, through good action, the fruits of which carry good karma, or again, through our personal merits and not through our birth status. Next slide, please. At this point, I will do 4 provisional comments. Like all critique, the Buddhist critique of caste has a normative grounding, and normative in two ways. First, from an epistemic viewpoint, the point is to correct the false view of the Brahmin, and second, from an ethic viewpoint. Therefore, caste is valued, caste bears value in terms of true, good, bad. Second remark, I will say that the Buddhists are the internal author of the caste society in ancient India. But as you know, Buddhism has been expelled from India in the first millennium. Third, the Buddhist critique and the ethicization of caste have been assimilated by Hinduism. The Buddhist critique of caste has nourished the Bhakti movement. This is now well known. And the Bhagavad Gita testifies of these new ethical values introduced by Buddhism. And I remind you that the Mahabharata is understood by scholars as an answer to the Buddhist critique of the Brahmanical order. Fourth remark, Buddhism came back to India in the 20th century through the conversion of the untouchable. But there is a reversal of the value of the bearer of Buddhism. While in ancient India, the first Buddhists were converted Brahmins, in the 20th century, the bearers of Buddhist value are the lowest group of the Indian society. Therefore, the Buddhist critique of caste has no chance, if any, of being received by the upper caste in the 20th century. I now move to the first comparative moment, the encounter with the Portuguese. Next slide, please. So my point is not to cover this issue that I deal with in my article. I simply make some comments focusing on the word casta and its comparative usage. Few remarks first on the semantic of the word casta and its usages in the Iberic world. The word casta is documented since the end of the 15th century. It belongs to the natural sciences, applied to animal and vegetal, and was extended to human population. Casta is often used as equivalent to raza. When applied to human beings, casta and raza are loaded with two opposite values. First, caste and raza can qualify whether purity, particularly purity of blood, chastity, there is a link between casta and castus, the Latin castus, or it can imply good lineage regarding particularly the nobility in Spain or Portugal. Secondly, caste and raza can qualify impurity, macule, tint, notably when applied to the Jews, the Moors, and the conversos, that means the new Christians, who were mainly Jews and Moors. In this sense, the word casta was associated with the politics of limpeza de sangue in Portuguese, or limpieza de sangre in Spanish, but is the purity of blood, which became a rule to exclude the new Christians, Jew or more, but mainly Jews, in fact, from offices. Then it became a rule, limpieza de sangre, to expel the Jews from Spain in 1492 and from Portugal, 1496, a few years before Vasco da Gama landed in Western India. Second remark, very briefly, in Portuguese India around 16th century, the words casta and raza are associated with law, custom, purity, hierarchy, commensality. And you will find the references to different works in the handout. Next slide, please. So let me now address what seems to me the most important point, but has been so far ignored to my knowledge. Maybe I am wrong, you will correct me. I refer to Emile Benveniste's work in English, The Four Divisions of Society, published in Dictionary of Indo-European Concept and Society, translated in 2016, translated from the French. In French, Les Quatre Cercles de l'Appartenance Sociale, published in Volume 1 of Le Vocabulaire des Institutions Indo-Européennes in 1969, which means 3 years after the publication of Homo Hierarchicus. I summarize Benveniste. The morphology of the word casta and its semantic field attest to its filiation with the Indo-European languages, particularly the Indo-European root in Indo-European gen. Castilian dictionaries associate casta with the Greek genos and Latin gens, which means people, race. Sanskrit jati, from the root jan, to be born, belongs to the same lexical family of Latin gens, to whom it is morphologically related. In their usages, Sanskrit jati and Latin janti refer both to birth as a social fact. So the Portuguese casta is, in a way, a translation of the Sanskrit jati, if we follow Emile Benveniste. Next slide. I summarize 4 key points, considering both the Iberic world and India in that time, 16th century. First, casta and raza are associated with the idea of purity. Casta and raza are associated with the idea of hierarchy, whether in India and in the Iberic world, regarding the Jews or regarding the debate on the true nobility in Spain. Casta and raza can be positively, this is chastity, or negatively, tint, macule, valued in the Iberic world. But contrary to the Buddhist critique, there is no epistemic stake in this case. The uses are practical and political, to distinguish, to separate, and to expel. Fourth remark, casta, jati, raza, or res. The etymology, the morphology, and the semantic of these 3 words are quite close. So, casta is not foreign to Indo-Aryan languages, and consequently, to the Indian society. Therefore, one can refute the thesis that the word casta referring to India, the ideas of caste and caste system are foreign to and imposed on the Indian social world. This is what I call the eliminativist thesis. I borrow this concept from analytical philosopher. The eliminativist thesis, which is defended by some Indian and Western scholars alike, who were part of what is called the Gain School. But you will not find any reference to the Gain School in my handout, although they have published many books. However, the importation of a single Portuguese word, casta, to describe the complexity of Indian social denominations opens the way to comparison against a background of lexical trouble. Next slide, please. I began my presentation by pointing out that authors from different backgrounds have emphasized the ethical dimension of caste. Over the last 15 years, moral philosophers and sociologists have renewed our understanding of values as moral and as social facts. Let me quote a sociologist. I quote, "This book is a systematic attempt to present sociology from the viewpoint of valuation as the primus mobile in the social universe. In the social universe, the nexus of all human relations, groups, and institutions." Unquote. This quotation is not from a recent book on the sociology of values, but from a book published in 1949 and entitled The Social Structure of Values, written by Radhakamal Mukherjee, the well-known Indian sociologist from Lucknow. Well, I leave aside Radhakamal Mukherjee to those interested in the history of sociology in India, and I will refer to more recent works, notably the book written by the French sociologist Nathalie Hennig, Des valeurs, une approche sociologique, about values, a sociological approach, published in 2017. The book has not been translated into English, but a paper, reference is in the handout, gives some understanding of her approach. But the model I'm presenting here is really inspired by this book and by others written by moral philosophers. And the bibliography on moral philosophy in English is huge by now, and there are different handbooks even. But as I said, my work is in progress, and my model, not at all a final model. So I will not give you a resume of the sociology of value, which is not the subject of my presentation. Just I will ask the question, what is an act of valuation? An act of valuation is what we do permanently. It can be applied either to persons, to things, or to states of the world. For example, suppose you are attending a seminar given by a foreign scholar, he or she. I do know that you will evaluate his or her presentation as a person, how he or she performed, and you will also evaluate the content of his or her presentation, the thing as such. And you will do it either in public or in private, or both, and face-to-face or not, to refer here to Erwin Goffman. An act of valuation implies a principle of valuation which engages a register of value and specific value attached to this register. I consider caste, class, and race as an example of the state of the world. Next slide, please. So I present the main registers of value and the core value attached to this register so that you can follow my presentation with the support of the figure. This will become clearer during the presentation. Next slide, please, as you have the figure with you. So I have identified 5 main registers of value. First one, the epistemic registers, where the main value, the core value, is truth. We already encountered this value with the Buddhist critique of caste. And this register will be detailed in my presentation. And at the end, I will come back to this quite complicated and complex register. Secondly, the ethics register, where the main value are good, bad or wrong, just or unjust, equitable or unequal, which imply also, of course, an idea of justice. The third register of value will be the judicial register. When people appeal to the court, people sue to settle caste dispute. So the main value here is law, right? And we will see that there are different way of referring to the judicial. The fourth register, I will call it the civic register, related to internal or domestic affairs. And we can have a fifth register, the action register, where here we are dealing with practical hand, with instrumental rationality in terms of efficacy. To these registers of value, I completed with different axes of polarity that you can follow in my in the figure. One axis is the opposition between distant and near concerning the issue debated, whether the author are close or distant to the issue of caste or race, for example. This opposition, distant and near, is associated with another distinction between the national or the international or the global. And another polarity is the opposition between particular and the universal, whose one example could be the opposition between Hinduism and Christianism, although there is much more in this latest polarity than this opposition, simple opposition between Hinduism and Christianism. We can certainly revise these 5 registers of value and the axes and find others. I will leave this issue open. And now I will try to illustrate this feature. But before moving ahead, I need to say that this comparative matrix is historically grounded, in the sense that the comparative dimension of caste emerges only with the Portuguese encounter. The Buddhist critique is an internal questioning of caste, but not really a comparative view. Yet, this critique still operates underneath a number of modern critical discourse on caste, particularly from Indian authors. However, if this matrix is historically grounded, it intends to be used in different historical contexts of modern India since the 16th century. Finally, I stress that I am not dealing with the real state of the world, that is, what is caste, what is class, what is race. My concern here are with the groundings of the valuation that scholars do when they compare caste, class, and race. So the first question is, how did this trilogy of caste, class, and race become associated in a syntagm? Next slide, please. So I jump ahead to the 19th century, when caste was imported from India into the US. The category then began a back and forth movement that continues today. First, I focus on the colonial century, roughly between 1815 and 1950. The importation and reception of the notion of caste, the idea of caste, the word caste in the US is now well documented by historians. The word was imported by American missionaries, and it spread first in abolitionist circles. But we need to avoid anachronisms in understanding the circulation of caste issues between British India and the US in the 19th century. there is a mirror relationship between British India and the US that took shape from the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century onward. And this mirror relationship still informs debates on caste in the 21st century. Caste was a stake between the British and the Americans over the abolition of slavery. One of the earliest occurrences of caste is probably in the abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, in 1831. You have the quotation here. I will just mention that in the 1830, for the abolitionists, caste means free black and not slave. Which begs the question, which caste are we talking about? To answer this question, we can refer to one of the best known references on the subject at that time, that of Charles Sumner pamphlet. Charles Sumner was a Republican, a senator, an abolitionist, who wrote a pamphlet called The Question of Caste in 1869, which means after the Civil War, what Charles Sumner called the rebellion. The sources of Charles Sumner are missionary publications. Sumner was a Protestant and Unitarian. Charles Sumner has a fairly good knowledge and understanding of the value system for his time. He insists on the polarization between the Brahmin, the Shudra, and the Pariah. Secondly, this polarization, said Sumner, is equivalent to white and black and yellow in the US. And the equivalence between whites and Brahmins comes from the designation of the Massachusetts elite as Brahmin. The caste system is for India, wrote Charles Sumner, what slavery was for the US before the Civil War. I quote, the cornerstone of the whole structure, unquote. So what is of particular interest, still from a comparative viewpoint, is the reasons why Sumner condemns caste and consequently slavery. Sumner appeals to the rights of man in the name of Christianity. I quote, if the great declaration, the rights of man, confined to a class, it would have been never, unquote. The universality of the human rights is grounded in Christian principle. Main principle is the unity of man. All men are equal. Therefore, wrote Sumner, common humanity forbids caste. Furthermore, Sumner stresses other points in his pamphlet. The domestic, which means the US dimension of the abolition of caste, and the link to the Republic regime. I quote, in the large interest beyond, I will not lose sight of the practical interest at home. It is important for our domestic peace not to speak of our good name as a republic, but this question, which means forbidding caste, should be settled, unquote. I dwelt at some length on Sumner's pamphlet because it contains many of the elements that structure the comparison between caste and race, although they need to be historicized. Next slide. 4 years after Charles Sumner's pamphlet, in 1873, Jyotirao Phule imported American slavery and the Negro issues into India in his booklet, Slavery. The history of Phule is well known, thanks notably to Rosalind O'Hanlon and other authors. Phule pamphlet is supposed to have been inspired by Thomas Paine's rights of man. But while Penn's book was supposed in India to find the struggle against the British colonial power, Pulley used it for specific domestic purposes to highlight the condition of the Shudra and untouchable in India. So in a way, it's a kind of reverse mirror of Sumner's pamphlet, although you can imagine that Pulley didn't know about Charles Sumner's pamphlet. So let us go back to the US at the turn of the 19th century. The trilogy of caste, class, and race was well established in the field of sociology. I mentioned three authors, William Thomas, Edward Ross. I didn't know myself about Edward Ross, but he wrote 4 lengthy articles on caste in 1917. And of course, Robert Park from Chicago in 1928 wrote, I quote, "Race prejudice is like class and caste prejudice, merely one variety of species." I underline, merely one variety of species. According to one American historian, a search for caste as a keyword in the American printed source yields 30,000 hits for the 19th century. So a question of method arises at this point. How can we study the uses of caste in such complex national, social, public, academic spaces? My aim is to objectify the valuation that are produced by authors discussing caste in a comparative manner. These evaluative judgments often arise in the process of debate and controversy. The key academic figure who led the debates on caste, class, and race in the US for the first half of the 20th century was unquestionably the Afro-American sociologist William Edward Booker Du Bois. And Du Bois was also concerned by the international dimension of the issue. So I selected a dozen of scholars, whether Indian, American, or European, who discussed, exchanged, debated on caste, class, and race with Du Bois. And I look at their arguments and valuation that they do when writing on the issues I am concerned here. I've selected for this presentation a few of these scholars. I start with Du Bois. Next one, please. Du Bois clearly articulates caste, class, and race just around caste in America in 1904. Segregation means color line, which means caste. This is a basic assumption still until almost now. So what is caste for Du Bois? Caste is a definite place preordained in custom, law, and religion where all men of black blood must be first. Well, custom and law, we can understand roughly what it means, but what he means by religion is not clear here to me, because you should know that Du Bois was a Protestant. Then Du Bois contrasted caste to class, class implying in the US, if I understand Du Bois well, a kind of formal equality between individuals, between the persons. So in contrast to the segregation of the color line. In Clash of Color, written in 1936, Du Bois wrote, I quote, "The great difficulty of bringing about understanding, sympathy, and cooperation between the Negroes of America and the peoples of India lies in the almost utter lack of knowledge which these two groups of people have of each other." End quote. The relationship between Dubois and Lajpat Rai is probably the longest and most rewarding for both, according to Dubois and Lajpat Rai's own account. Next one, please. So Lajpat Rai was a contemporary of Dubois. As you know, he's an Indian freedom fighter, a Punjabi, a member of the Brahmo Samaj and of Indian National Congress, and an Agrawal Jain. He stayed in the US, I think 2 times, but his longest stay was in 1916, 1918, and was acquainted with many Afro-American scholars, not only with Dubois. He wrote 2 books where he deals with caste and race. The first one is the United States of America, published in 1916, and the second one is Unhappy India in 1928. Lajpat Rai is a good example of the difficulties we face to understand properly the uses of the caste category in a comparative manner. Firstly, the lexical dimension of the category allows for shifts in its meaning. Considering, from Lajpat Rai, considering that Varna means color, however we understand the meaning of color and the association with Varna, whether it is true or not. But assuming that Varna means color, Lajpat Rai equates Varna with race, assuming that race is colored, following Dubois. But considering the category Jati, the operation is slightly different with Lajpat Rai. Varna, says Lajpat Rai, is a category that belongs to the Hindu law, which is not the case of Jati. Jati is a true caste. Therefore, Jati as caste can be separated from Hinduism, from Hindu law, considered as a religion. Then Lajpat Rai said, I quote, "The current ideas on caste are not necessarily part of Hinduism or of the Hindu religion." End quote. Secondly, the 2 different statements that Lajpat Rai wrote on caste and the Negro, this is his word and I will use it, attest the indexical dimension of discourses on caste. In the United States of America, the categories, Negros and Paria, are put on the same footing to be condemned. Negros and Paria are alike. But 10 years later, in Unhappy India, the national dimension takes precedence and the comparison is evaluative in favor of India. The Negroes are worse off than the Paria. The point is that in 1928, the Indian society needed to be defended, according to Lajpat Rai and other scholars, notably Tagore, against Catherine Mayo's virulent critique of India in her book, Mother India. In other words, the domestic as register of values is interlocked, or the polarity is interlocked with the opposition near distant. The distant Negro, for Lajpat Rai, is worse than the nearer, the domestic Paria. How these issues are articulated by Ambedkar. Next one, please. The views of Lajpat Rai and Ambedkar concerning the situation of the untouchable in their time and in the near future were quite different. I will stress 2 points. First, in his article published in 1917, which is an outcome of the communication presented by Ambedkar at Columbia University the year before, in 1916, Ambedkar emphasized the cultural unity of the Indian society, of which the untouchable are a part, whatever are their real conditions. While in the US, stress Ambedkar, the Negroes are not native, compared to the pariah, who for Ambedkar are native. Secondly, Ambedkar answered Lajpat Rai comparative judgment on slavery and untouchability. After considering the situation from an historical perspective, including interesting remarks on the Jews in France after the revolution, Ambedkar concluded, quite the opposite of Lajpat Rai, that untouchables have been worse in India than the Negroes. The reversal of Ambedkar's position in relation to Lajpat Rai must be indexed to the domestic register of values. But the value of the domestic has changed. For Lajpat Rai, the domestic is valued in relation to the struggle for national independence. For Ambedkar, the domestic is valued in relation to the place of untouchable in India's independence. In this case, the domestic is oriented toward different political aims. Next one, please. So there is a relationship that seems at first sight unexpected. It is a personal link between Dubois and Max Weber. Dubois attended Weber's seminar at Berlin as soon as 1894, and both Dubois and Weber met in 1904 in the US at St. Louis, Missouri, where they attended a conference at the World Fair. Weber's observations that he did in the American South can be found firstly in his book, Hinduisms and Buddhisms, and secondly, in his communication on race and society at the first Congress of the German Sociological Society in 1910. In Hinduisms and Buddhisms, these observations take a comparative form between Hindu caste and the Negro, also a word used by Weber, concerning blood purity, segregation, marriage, or commensality. These comparative statements are the consequences of Weber's view that not every caste is a Hindu caste, while caste is essential to the Hindu. At the same time, Weber, as you know, defined caste as a stand, an order, classified according to a religious or a ritualist orientation. Therefore, caste, for Weber, is a social organization that is particular to India regarding the form that caste takes in this society. Here again, we touch a lexical difficulty, as Varna and Jati are subsumed within the category of caste, stand, order. Moreover, the dissociation of caste and Hinduisms allows Weber to extend the concept of caste, or more precisely, Weber generalized the idea of a pariah caste, and he used it to characterize the situation of the Jews as a collective entity in the longue durée of the European history. And the well-known quotation is taken from ancient Judaisms. The preliminary remark, the book starts with this remark. Next slide, please. Well, the comparison between caste and race in the US crystallized around World War II in what was called the modern caste school of race relation. In the book Deep South, a monograph on a small town of the American South, the author, Lloyd Warner, Alison Davis, and the gardener, it's a couple, they extended the concept of caste to the Black population of the city they studied. Yes. But at the same time, another American sociologist, Oliver Cox, from a Marxist viewpoint, strongly opposed these views, and he stated that the Indian caste system was particular to Indian society and to the Brahmanical society. Just for your information, Lloyd Warner and Gardner are white American sociologists. Alison Davis is an Afro-American. Oliver Cox is also a black sociologist, but not from America, from Trinidad. So this debate regarding the modern caste school of race relation has been much analyzed by Louis Dumont in Homo Hierarchicus, in 2 chapters of comparative issue, plus 1 on stratification. And the issue also has been revisited quite recently, 10 years ago, by the anthropologist from India, Chris Fuller. As I'm running short of time, I'm going to skip this development and move to the third comparative moment that opens with the independence of India. Next one, please. Yes, okay, this is the next one about the reference of Oliver Cox. Okay. In 1946, Ambedkar wrote to Dubois, I quote, "I was very much interested to read that the Negroes of America have filed a petition to the United Nations organization. The untouchable of India are also thinking of following suit. Will you be so good as to secure for me 2 or 3 copies of this representation by the Negroes and send them to my address?" Unquote. Then Dubois replied in July 46, I quote, "I have your letter concerning the case of the Negroes of America and the untouchable in India before the United Nations. As you say, a small organization of American Negroes, the National Negro Congress, has already made a statement, which I am enclosing. I think, however, that a much more comprehensive statement, well documented, will eventually be led before the United Nations by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, which was the main organization fighting for the right of the Black people. If this is done, I shall be glad to send you a copy." Unquote, Dubois. This exchange, so 46, this exchange of information between Ambedkar and Dubois exemplify the opening of the new comparative moment, a third one in which we are still now. This moment can be captured by the term global or globalization, which is widely used by the actors. Globalization first describes what the actors say concerning what they do or intend to do. Because for some actors, the word has also a prescriptive meaning in the sense that they intend to globalize caste or to make caste global, as wrote Suraj Yengze. At this point, the work of Pierre Bourdieu and Yves Desalé, the French sociologist, will be particularly useful. And I'm referring to Pierre Bourdieu, the reference is in the handout. The international legal field, the article is in French. It is a preface to Yves Desalé's book, which deals with the international legal field. To limit myself to the comparative dimension, I will briefly mention 2 issues at that time. Firstly, after World War II, there was a political process whereby some newly decolonized nations tried to build an international political arena to make their voice heard. The major moment was the Bandung Conference in 1955, whose outcome was the non-aligned movement, with some other player conference 47 in Delhi. For Nehru, one of the stakes was to project India as holder of the core Asian values. Secondly, there was another political process whereby the issue of human rights became eminent under the United Nations Agency or under the NGOs. And right from 1946, this is the issue of the letters between Dubois and Ambedkar. For the Dalits, the challenge was to gain recognition for the degraded condition of their caste and to get this condition recognized as violation of universal human rights. This last process gains momentum in the 1990s, ending in 2001 with the Durban World Conference Against Racism. The issue of this conference was, should caste be recognized by the United Nations as equivalent to race and consequently casteism recognized as a form of racism? The debates that took place in the preparation of the conference and during the conference itself involved officials from the Indian government, scholars, lawyers, journalists, Dalit activists, and NGOs organizations. Some of you here probably remember the very heated debates that took place in the press and magazine at that time. These debates have been understood mainly from a political or ideological angle. But these debates should be set, it seems to me, in a different framework to understand a more complex conflict between different registers of values that structure and divide the comparison between caste and race in this particular case. Next slide, please. So I'm giving just two examples, which I am making anonymous so as not to get into individual polemics. First, in my view, I quote, in my view, the best way to nail down the caste is race thesis is to logically show how this equation is politically misleading, if not, in fact, dangerous. This exercise has clear political implication, unquote, from a paper published in 2001. Here, it seems to me that reference to logically show, the thesis is to logically show, refer to the epistemic register, which is reduced to action or political register. And in this case, the epistemic register is the ancillary of the political register. The political action is itself valued ethically as condemned. Second example, I quote, it is sad but true that many forms of invidious discrimination do prevail in the contemporary world. But to assimilate or even relate them all to racial discrimination will be an act of political and moral irresponsibility. Here we are dealing with the ethic register, which is used to qualify both discrimination are invidious, and ethical register is mobilized to value political action as irresponsible. Next one, please. Yes. One of the registers of value to which the agents appeal in the domestic register is the domestic register that I already mentioned. The domestic, that is the national, as opposed to the international or the global. Two examples, one from 2001. It is never legitimate for the United Nations to legislate, let alone police individual behavior in our society. The battle has to be fought within our respective society. It is from the India spokesperson at the Durban conference. But these statements echoes another declaration in the 1920, I quote, but certainly it does not lie in the mouth of the white people to tell us that we are a world menace or that we treat a section of the humanity as less than men. It is from Lajpat Rai, UNAPI, India, 1928. At that time, the domestic issue is amplified by the colonial, anti-colonial situation and the colonial, anti-colonial stance taken by, here, anti-colonial stance taken by Lajpat Rai. Next one, please. I come to some concluding remark regarding the epistemic registers of value, which is the more complex. Regarding the epistemic register of value, I will distinguish between two ways of considering caste. First, caste can be considered, yes, I repeat. Caste can be considered in a thick sense, but is loaded with thick properties, as when we speak of the Indian caste system. Within this understanding, there are differences between authors, depending on whether they favored integration through supreme value or not, or conflict. So I do not enter this debate, but there are different points of view. There's different viewpoint, even for those who are considering the caste system, or whether they consider the caste system particular to India or not. And again, there is a geographical gradation, whether scholars limit caste to South Asia, between Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, or they extend it beyond South Asia. At that point, the disjunctive character of the idea of caste is at stake. It is not clear whether scholars are considering caste or the caste system outside of India. This point introduced me to the second sense of caste. Secondly, caste can be considered in a thin sense, with less descriptive properties. Then scholars speak of caste without considering the system of caste. So that different operations should be presumed, but are regularly not explicit by the author. First, Hinduism has to be considered as a religion in the Western sense of the word, and not as a way of life, as Weber put it. Secondly, caste has to be separated from Hinduism when Hinduism is considered as a religion. Then caste is then reduced to the Dalit, to the black, and to the subalterns. Then caste can be globalized. I give an example. I quote, caste is approached as a regime of discrimination, which makes it possible for us to compare it to similar realities and structure elsewhere, such as race and other forms of ethnic formation. Unquote. 2016. This type of comparison has a cost, which lies in the sociological processes of separation and reduction, what I have just outlined. And these remarks opens up another question, and this will be my last word. What other kind of comparison would caste and the caste system in the thick sense allow? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Roland, for this fantastic and very comprehensive presentation. I will now let Professor Satish Deshpande give his thoughts about this presentation, and then we will move on to a Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was just telling Roland before he started to speak that he had here actually a book. And I think the rest of you will now begin to see how this is, in fact, a book in the making. He was kind enough to send me his presentation some days ago, so I had a little bit of an advantage over you in having looked at the presentation and marveling at its scope. Traditionally, the job of a respondent is to be complimentary and complementary. While the first is very easy, in the case of Roland, I've known him for a long time, and as this work also shows, he's the scholar's scholar, who writes books that are, in the good sense, not easy to read. and which are densely and very, very thickly, one should say, using a word that he has been using and which we shall return to shortly, thickly grounded in historical fact and historical narratives. And so presents a very compelling scholarly case for the arguments that he puts forward. So this is just another example of what we know that Roland is very well capable of. The job of being complementary to something that is already so comprehensive is beyond me. So I will not attempt that. I will try to be to perform a different role, and that is of amplification and reiteration. So let me begin with the title of his presentation, which really intrigued me. Is the concept of caste a relevant comparative concept? That is the title. To me, it reduces, this amounts to a statement, and I will explain in a moment, that the most important word here is relevant. Because to me and to those who study caste, caste is constitutively comparative. The very idea of caste is about comparing. It's a relational concept. And therefore, comparison is about a sense of relatedness to which some intellectual, or if you want a grander term, epistemic purpose is being attached. So if caste is by its very essence constituted as something comparison, so the left side of this, if you use a mathematical sort of metaphor, the first concept of caste and comparative concept are identities. So this becomes tautological, then the only word left is relevant, and it becomes a very, very important word, because that's indeed, in my opinion, that's the most important, the reason why all of us should take, and not only those of us interested in caste, should take Roland's work with great seriousness, is in the sense of relevance that he's talking about. How is relatedness relevant? That is to say, what, being a good colonial, I immediately looked up the dictionary. We are now made very aware these days that we operate in languages which are not our own, although I do believe English is an Indian language by now, but still. According to the Cambridge Dictionary, the relevance, the noun, is described as the degree to which something is related or useful to what is happening or being talked about. So caste as itself inherently a comparative based on comparison, an entity that is itself comparison incarnated, if you like, used in a comparative sense, where the second sense of comparative is in a social science sense of a particular method. What would that mean? What uses could this relatedness, when we relate caste to something else, what uses could this be put to? What kinds of, if you like, in one sense, leverage or traction can be derived from this juxtaposition? Or in another sense, what kind of insight or understanding could be derived from this? This, I think, is what Roland's work is about. And in that sense, I think it is about comparison itself as a category, as a method. So in short, I think he's talking to us about something I believe very, very crucial, and that is to focus on the work that theory does rather than on theory itself. What does it enable us to do that we would not have been able to do otherwise in its absence? That really is what he's bringing to us here. And as an illustration of that, because I think to understand the importance and the breadth of what Roland is saying, we need to take it away from caste. So let me suggest very provocatively two other similar kinds of juxtapositions and valuations, contrasting valuations, to see what use we can make of them. Use in quotes we can make of them in the present. Suppose I was to suggest to you that let us compare or put in the frame of comparison the Ukraine-Russia conflict and the Palestine-Israel conflict. If we were to place them in the same frame with some sense of comparison, what leverage do we draw? What is the traction that we get from this? What use does this serve? Or to take a less, perhaps, an example to which at least we in India are deadened to, but the recent Bihar caste census has reignited these issues and the discomfort around these issues. Think of the political common sense around majority and minority and how it plays out in the context of religion versus the context of caste. Much of the interest and anxiety that the caste census is arousing is because, I would suggest, because of this contrast that majority and minority in one context and majority and minority in another context are, as Roland would say, being valued differently. These are just examples of the kinds of leverage that we can derive from comparison as such. Let me come now to one or two places where I was wondering about the absence in one case and insufficient presence in another case. I was very curious, Roland, about how small a place Louis Dumont has in this present. Maybe in your larger work, he will play a bigger role. But in a sense, this is his life's work. Homo hierarchicus, homo equalis. And he also has a book on values, if I remember correctly, on value. So it would seem to mirror this, the frame that you're drawing. It would seem that he is engaged in precisely this kind of thing, and where he says that he tries to make clear that it's at the ideological level that either a society is hierarchical, as he says that Hindu society is, or is egalitarian, as he says Western society is. But the other of hierarchy and equality has to make its way, as he says, I think, shamefacedly into reality, into empirical reality. Hierarchy in the Western case and equality in the Indian case. So I would have thought that that project was, much closer to yours, and therefore would need more, more detailed engagement. The name that I find missing here, which is perhaps not surprising because the book I'm referring to is a very small book, less than 100 pages. And Roland always writes books which are well over 100 pages. So Ursula Sharma is the name I'm looking at. It's a small, I'm sure you're aware of it. It's a small, book on, which impressed me immensely. It came out in 1999, and I read it very soon after the Durban incidents that you're talking about. And I thought it dealt with the question admirably, with admirable clarity, and I think an excellent example of good reasoning. And I think she is trying to do the same. That is to say, make caste available as a comparative concept, and is trying to do away with the inhibitions that have prevented its being used in such a way. There is a word she uses, that caste has been a precarious concept in the social sciences, and she wants to make it less. It has been precarious because of its unique association with India, and she's contesting that in doing this. So I would like to hear. I'm sure you're aware of this work, and I would like to hear. Finally, just to start the epigraphs that you start with, I think much of the history of the academic study of caste, definitely in India, I can't say the same for other places since I don't know enough, has been a case of resisting the claim made in your first epigraph that caste is both moral judgment and sociological description. In fact, the study of caste has insisted that sociological description must refrain from or stay away from moral judgment, and that bringing moral judgments in makes descriptions sociologically bad. I'm putting this crudely, but that has been an argument and a very powerful, dominant argument for long, so that anyone who brings in moral questions around or political questions around caste is seen as somehow muddying the waters, the pristine, clear, still waters of the academy by bringing in these considerations. So I think you need to make room for the fact that it has not been easy to bring this as an academic concern. The argument would always be, yes, of course, there are politicians and this is the reason why Ambedkar has been kept out of the canon for so long. And today he's being brought back into the canon, not always for the best reasons. But the turnaround that is happening has very little to do with the intellectual content of Ambedkar's work. It has to do with everything around, the world around us. So a scholar of the stature of Ambedkar, a stature which we are beginning to realize today, is kept out precisely because this connection is denied. And it is said that when you study a social system, you must do it without without taking a moral stand. So I am finally, I did not, I mean, this is of course, as you say, Heineck's book is not yet translated, and what we have available is only an article, a summary article book. But I was not very clear as to how you were using the values framework here. Although your examples brought it out very clearly, I was wondering whether you could do without it, because it didn't seem to me that the contrasting valuations were clear enough in the empirical and did not seem to me to require further justification. So I'll just stop here because, this is such a wide-ranging presentation, and it's such an important project, as I tried to point out, the project of, in a sense, comparing comparisons, which I think is in an larger academic sense, beyond just caste or India, a very important question, especially since we now are used to the claim that the world is globalized. Comparison as a concept is about, if you like, a certain kind of sharing, a certain kind of inclusion. But the trick is that the inclusion is not necessarily a vis-a-vis, which suggests equality, which suggests an equal plane. It's often on a tilted playing field. And the tilt is not only on one dimension, it can be on many dimensions, and we become aware of these tilts much later. So while it would seem to be a step forward, I would think that those of us who, now in a sense, all of us are marked by colonialism. Some of us, in some ways, those of us who come from ex-colonial countries and those who are from the ex-colonized countries, all of us are marked. But colonialism marked the moment when comparison was no longer an option. It was simply a fact, because difference had been acknowledged through colonialism in a particular way, and the language of globalization only brings it back in a more sanitized, more palatable way. So in the world today, comparison is life. It's not a choice. And that's why I think your work, because it foregrounds comparison and looks at the challenges that comparison involves, is, I think, very, very important. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Satish, for your... I suggest that maybe, if you want, you can take a very short time to answer part of these questions. I realize that there's much food for thought in Satish's comments. So maybe if you can just briefly answer or choose to answer certain questions, and then we will move on to the Q&A. We want to make sure that everyone has a chance to ask. I mean, not everyone, but at least that people here in the audience have a chance to ask a few questions. Thank you.
The question regarding, sorry, thank you. Regarding Ursula Sharma books, I know the book. I have not read it again recently, but still at the book. I will have a look at the book. I don't have the book in mind. But about Louis Dumont, well, I don't want to open this issue, but your question is absolutely right, because I could have had a last slide coming back to some issue of Dumont regarding the comparative method that Dumont is trying to do, I mean, particularly at the end of this book, because definitely for those who know well Homo hierarchicus, all the questions I raised today are dealt with at length with Dumont in the last 2 chapters, which are particularly on comparative aspect of caste, and the plus the article which is only in the English edition. I mean, in the French edition there are 4 appendices, but in the English edition there is only 1. It's on caste and stratification. So caste and stratification, where he deals with the American School of Press Relation, and the comparative aspect is deal with in the 2 last chapters. Though I had already prepared something on this issue, but it should be another seminar. Stop.
Me just conclude this session by thanking both of you, Roland Lardinois and Satish Deshpande, for the very stimulating presentation and discussion. We will have our next seminar on the 20th November, where we will discuss the question of modernity with Meena Bhargav and Pratyainath, who will come to present their edited volume, The Early Modern in South Asia, Querying Modernity, Periodization, and History. Thank you again, and